American people about military assets in Washington, D.C. So with that, let me turn to Chief Newsham.
Thank you, Mayor Bowser. Thank you for your continued leadership during these very difficult times. Last night we had our sixth night of protests, consecutive nights of protests here in Washington, D.C. Some of the things that were different than what we've seen in the prior 5 nights. Much larger numbers in the city. We estimate in excess of 5,000 peaceful demonstrators. One of the other unique things about this group is they started earlier in the day. We had multiple groups marching simultaneously throughout the city in multiple locations. I had hoped to be able to report on this today, and thankfully I am. There were 0 arrests associated with the peaceful demonstrations that we had here in our city. There was no damage to MPD property. There was no MPD injuries. Moving forward over the next couple of days, we expect more of the same. We have a lot of public open source information to suggest that the event on this upcoming Saturday may be one of the largest that we've had in the city. We expect that Saturday's demonstration will, like I said, be more of the same. Peaceful demonstrators coming to exercise their First Amendment right in Washington, D.C. With regards to numbers of arrests over the last several days, on Friday night we did not have any. Saturday night we had 19. Sunday we had 90. Monday 289. Tuesday 29. And as of 9 o'clock this morning we had 0 yesterday. Overall, 44% of our arrests are from people who are either residents or associated with the District of Columbia. 31% have identified as residents of the state of Maryland. 13% have identified as being from the state of Virginia. 4% have identified as being from other states, and 8% have no fixed address or it is unknown their state of origin. 63% of the arrests that we made were for curfew violations. 11% were for rioting, and 10% were for burglary. If you want more specifics regarding the arrests, more additional detailed arrest information, you can get that on our website at mpdc.dc.gov. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
One question for the chief, one for you, Mayor Bowser.
Sure.
Chief, what are you doing to
Can you just identify yourself?
I'm sorry, Scott McFarland, Channel 4,
Okay.
The Mask. Chief, what are you doing to prevent COVID-19 from spreading among those you arrest in those small police vehicles, some without masks?
Yeah, that's a challenge for us. So to the extent that we can distribute masks, we are. It's a concern for us. And I think that you've heard a lot of conversation about that. As you heard the percentage of people that are coming from outside the district into the district to participate. We're going to ask anybody that's going to attend any events today or moving forward into the future to try to the extent that they can protect themselves and others by wearing masks and appropriately social distancing if they can.
Mayor Bowser, when the National Guard was called up, was that seamless and flawless how the administration called up our district's National Guard, or could they have done that better? And Congresswoman Holmes Norton wants to give you direct control of that so there are no issues in the future.
We called up the Guard, as you know, as part of our COVID response. I would say that response took longer than this response, calling them up for this public safety emergency. Yes.
Harry Jaffe, freelance. I'm confused by who's controlling the streets of Washington, D.C. when it comes to policing. We have reports of the Attorney General Barr having a command post at the FBI. You all have a unified command post up on Martin Luther King Boulevard. When it comes to when darkness comes and the protests get a little dicey, who's controlling the streets? Who's calling the shots? The chief keeps talking about his federal partners. What's the state of that federal partnership?
Well, I'll say it simply, and I'll ask the chief to provide more detail. But very simply put, Peter Newsham controls the Metropolitan Police Department. He works with federal partners, and there are particular ones that he has requested to help us with traffic posts. And he'll speak directly to which ones they are. And then there are other federal military assets that we did not request that we understand are under the direction of the Attorney General Barr.
So, specifically, last night there was a line of military officers blocking the streets just around K Street and certainly below that. This morning, 8th Street was clear to the fence of Lafayette Park. Who deploys those assets?
We were all very concerned about how the federal assets pushed out from the federal complex. And we worked with them to push back.
What does that mean?
Just what I said.
You worked with them, so you were in communication with the military police and requesting them to reduce their presence in the city?
We are in communication to communicate our needs, absolutely, and to communicate, obviously, the very first thing is we want the military, we want troops from out of state, out of Washington, D.C. Yes?
Just to follow up on that, the White House, can you comment a bit more on how you felt about seeing the White House in this increasing military protection?
I've commented on that quite a bit. I mean, do you have a specific question?
I'm just trying to understand more specifically whether you felt that the protection was adequate, those barriers should move farther in so people can get closer.
Yes. So we saw, I think beginning yesterday, and maybe I'm losing the hours a little bit, but I think beginning yesterday, we saw their line push out from Lafayette Park, which they can argue is part of the federal complex that they should police, in which we agree with, that they should police around the federal park. When they pushed out onto a DC street, that is too far, and that is what we push back on. Yes.
Jordan Pascal from WAMU. I have seen sentiment from some residents that say having the troops, the military vehicles, the federal enforcement agents on the streets feels like an occupation in some ways. How would you describe that presence, and what do you say to the people that are upset with this response?
Well, this is what I say. People have to understand the root cause and be willing to do something about the root cause. We are the nation's capital, a federal district. We're more than 700,000 tax-paying Americans who don't have full representation in the Congress and don't have full autonomy. And so until we fix that, we are subject to the whims of the federal government. Sometimes they're benevolent and sometimes they're not. And so we have to fix that.
To follow up on that, the protests are on top of all of the coronavirus pandemic. I'm starting to think that in this moment there's more fencing, more road closures. How would this be different if businesses were open and crowds of tourists were in town?
I'm not sure I understand. How would what be different?
Well, I'm trying to think, with all these roads closed and all these military presence, tourists that are in town and people are trying to get to work. Do you think the federal response and your response would be different if life was more normal right now?
I think that we certainly would still be responding to our public safety concerns. There are still tourists here. I met some of them yesterday. There's still people here having dinner outside on patios in the District of Columbia, even close to this perimeter. There are still people going to parks and walking down streets and living life. In fact, in almost every part of Washington, except where we are, around the federal complex, people are going about their daily lives. They wanted to take a picture, they were visiting, and they were exercising their First Amendment rights. Harry.
So there are reports earlier in the week that the White House wanted to invoke its emergency powers under the Home Rule Act to take over the D.C. police. and there were reports that there were negotiations back and forth, that the executive office of the mayor actually had conversations with the White House. Can you describe what those negotiations
Well, I've spoken about this already, Harry, and I will say this, that I can't discuss every private conversation, but know this, that at no time is the mayor going to support the federal government directing MPD. Yes.
A couple questions. Curfew, yes or no tonight?
We will not impose a curfew tonight.
Okay, great. So going back to kind of another stab at Harry's question about
Sure.
the coordination and how much heads up? I mean, you say you push back, but yesterday we saw them go all the way out to L Street. I mean, every day the perimeter expands another couple of blocks, clearly way into DC jurisdiction, into Chief Newsom's jurisdiction. One, do they tell you in advance? And two, you say you push back. Have you had any success? I mean, did they want to?
They're back. They're back this morning
Back.
to Lafayette.
Okay, and so you consider that, and you think they'll stay there?
Let me just say this, Mark. We're dealing with a fluid and unprecedented situation. Yesterday, I've been working largely over at our EOC at Health, and this week I've been working here. Yesterday, as you know, I walked down 16th Street towards the White House and could see for myself how far that line had come out. And I directed at that time for the chief and others to let's work on whatever we have to do with whomever to get that line pushed back. They can make an argument for protecting their federal assets, especially the White House, but pushing back into the district, blocking access to St. John's. We were there with the bishop yesterday. And if she wanted to go to the church, she couldn't have. She would have had to gone through the line. So DC residents need access to DC streets unless there can be a compelling reason. Now, also keep in mind that some of the perimeter traffic posts are MPD directed. And depending on the movements in the city and their need to protect or help people move, to make safe protesters moving through the city, they may create their own perimeter.
And then I'm sorry if I just follow up. You said you've been looking at the legal authority that the president has to do this, to bring troops in from out of state and to close DC streets and possibly federalize MPD. What have you determined? Have your lawyers given you any feedback?
Well, I mentioned yesterday that I had conversations with our Attorney General, and we had further conversations today with the Attorney General's office, but other legal scholars as well, including Councilmember Mary Che. And so those questions are being posed specifically if the president can call other states' guard into DC without taking further legal action.
What would you do? Would you go
talk to Governor Hogan?
I have not talked to Governor Hogan.
He says you approved his mission.
I can't approve his mission. Let me explain to you how this works, Mark. If I wanted troops from Maryland to come into the district, we are a member of a compact, which allows me to make that request specifically to any state National Guard to do that. I have not done that for any state.
Since they're no longer blocking so many streets today, like I saw in Chinatown yesterday, are you satisfied with where they're at now, or would you like them to scale back further?
I don't have a complete download on that. I'm happy that they're pushed back to Lafayette Park, and I'll do a scan of any other concerns that we have today. Yes.
Some of us might remember that Pennsylvania Avenue used to have traffic right in front of the White House, and
Yep.
it got closed off. And security pushed back further. Do you have any sense of whether that might happen to Lafayette Park, and how would you react? I know it's federal territory.
You know, I'm glad you asked me that, Harry, because I just had that conversation with some of my team. And I'm one of those people who grew up in Washington, D.C., and has been very accustomed to being able to have access to all of our federal facilities. Going up on the Capitol grounds, you know, our congresswoman had to push back from not allowing slaying on the Capitol, from being able to walk all around the Supreme Court, to walk in front of the White House, on both sides. And now all of that is under threat. I'm also concerned that some of the hardening that they're doing may be not just temporary. And so we would also have to push back from that. So keep in mind that that's the people's house. It's a sad commentary that the house and its inhabitants have to be walled off. I think that's a sad commentary. We should want the White House to be opened up for people to be able to access it from all sides. And I dare say that looking at traffic management permanently is also important. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, I have a COVID question, but just to follow up on that answer. So when you say you fear that some of the hardening up might become permanent, what are you talking? Do you think they might close off what is now Pennsylvania Avenue Plaza to?
Well, I would just say they are very unconventional. And we know that we have all kinds of federal authorities, including the National Capital Park and Planning Commission, like NCPC, that comments on every detail of the White House complex, except in an emergency. So it's going to be very important that even when they made the fence taller, which was an argument that could be made from that, there was a lot of discussion over changes to that complex. And so while we're right in the middle of a public health and public safety emergency, actually, we have to think about those assets. Those are federal assets, true, but they're also very important to local Washington and to our country. So people need to have access to our public buildings.
Can I ask just COVID? I know you said by the end of the week you'll tell us about the metrics, but today the data released show that once again the community spread downward trend has stalled, and you warn that you are anticipating yet another spike from data that has yet to come in that could reset this to day zero. What do you tell people about how close we're getting to phase 2 and where we are at in battling? I know you're dealing with.
Yes, and we do expect Mark to return over to the EOC tomorrow and have Dr. Nesbitt present to have a fuller conversation about COVID metrics and our progress in phase 1.
What can you say about this stall and spike in the numbers?
The numbers are what they are at this point. That's all I can say. The other thing that I would say, however, is, and I said this yesterday, that we want to make sure that people aren't delaying getting tested. Our testing locations are open. We saw a lull in testing and people going to get tests for, I think, almost a week. So we want to make sure that people are not delaying getting tested. Our citywide sites are open, and all of their private providers are open. And we are testing this week access to pre-COVID testing at our fire stations. And we will announce next week the fire stations where free COVID testing will be available. Yes?
I wanted to try to clarify, you were talking about pushing back when federal authorities were going into DC streets. Can you explain how that conversation goes? Who do you talk to make that request?
It would depend. The things that we need done, or I, in this case, directed Chief Newsham to identify who was responsible for that pushback and get it moved back.
And who was it?
Chief.
I've had multiple conversations with federal leadership, and I've expressed, and of course the mayor, and expressed the city's desire. After they expanded their footprint into DC streets, there was a strong desire by the mayor to have them go back to the federal complex, which they did, and they've done that this morning. So I think that we should call that a success. Can I talk a little bit about the prior conversation too, is that, and this is because I've gotten a lot of people from the community who have reached out about what they perceive as this military takeover, and it's really hard to distinguish between our DC National Guard and some of these other federal resources that we're talking about. They look the same, they look like soldiers. So we did request DC National Guard assistance. And the other thing, and the mayor was adamant about this, and she was just talking about it, is she does not want the folks who live in the District of Columbia to have their freedom restricted. But some of the traffic closures that MPD is responsible for is 100% to ensure the safety of the peaceful demonstrators. You cannot have vehicles moving through people who are almost exclusively moving on bicycles and on foot. To have vehicles in that situation is extremely dangerous. So I just want to make it clear that our request of the Guard was to prevent, to close some streets so we could have free movement of and that's not uncommon for large demonstrations here in the District of Columbia.
To follow on that question, you know, when push comes to shove, and there's tension and conflict around, you know, right by now Lafayette Park, to use your language, what's the chain of command when the federal authorities want to push from federal land onto District of Columbia property? How does that work?
It's a collaborative agreement and a cooperation and communication. If the federal government expands their footprint, we're obviously not going to get into a physical conflict over that. I think that's more of a legal battle that may have to play out moving forward into the future, particularly, as the mayor mentioned, in the middle of a public safety concern for the city. So they did it. We were successful in getting them to move back, and I think we should all be very pleased about at least that.
Chief, you mentioned about how many different people are out there that you can't tell who they are. And should people be concerned? There are a lot of, and it's hard to tell if they're military or whether they're law enforcement, but they're uniformed, they're carrying weapons, and they have no insignias. They don't have badges. You don't know.
Yeah, that's. I think you know too. For there's a local legal requirement that the Metropolitan Police Department identify themselves, and I know that if you see, even if our officers on Saturday and Sunday when they had to put on helmets to protect themselves, there's clear insignia on the helmet of who we are and exactly by number who they are, so we can identify them. And I think in any follow-up after action that we do with our federal partners, that would be a big ask of us. That any resources that they bring in the District of Columbia can be clearly identifiable as to who they are, because people might feel more comfortable if they could look at people who appear to be soldiers and see, oh, that's the DC National Guard, because the DC National Guard is in DC regularly. Not regularly, but from time to time to assist with large events.
The DC National Guard, for the most part, have a DC
They
flag.
have a DC flag.
Okay,
Right.
well, that's a, yeah, okay, good.
Right.
Yeah, so maybe that's a good thing that you all could push out when people are seeing these things. If they got a flag, that's our own DC National Guard.
So is it legal for these law enforcement or military to be on our streets armed without, I mean, you say your officers are required to have that. Are they required to identify in some manner who they're with or what agency or branch?
I think you're asking two different questions. The first question is whether or not the DC National Guard can legally be on our streets.
I'm talking about the Guard. I'm
Okay.
talking about these out of, you know, the other federal.
I think that's a question that's going to be resolved moving forward. Okay.
Based on what the mayor said, it sounded like the Attorney General was the one who ordered the expansion. Is that who you asked to scale back, or who's calling the shots here for this?
I think the mayor said it very well. I can't talk about every single particularly operational conversation that I've had during the course of these events. But I think that the federal properties are being controlled by federal resources, and this is the line that has been drawn since the very beginning. And the Metropolitan Police Department is responsible for the city streets and our communities.
you can understand our frustration of reporters. We can't figure out who's calling the shots sometimes.
I think it's, if you look at actions that are being taken in and around federal properties, it's federal resources. If you'd seen the actions that are taken on our local streets, it's MPD, other than the quick expansion we saw the other day.
So I just hope that you take some of that frustration and channel it into your coverage of DC statehood and why we need to be autonomous. So I'm looking forward to that. Yes.
So we're expecting, from your comments, a large protest or on Saturday. How many people, do you have any idea how many people we're expecting?
I'll ask the chief to talk about our plans for Saturday.
Those numbers are difficult to judge. We have to consider, this is the stuff that we're seeing on open source. There's an indication that there's a call out for large numbers, but it's not DC specific. There's a national call out. So you can look back at, we've had similar demonstrations across that were nationwide, so big cities across the country. And so that's where we're trying to judge our numbers. But at the end of the day, it's unpredictable. I mean, you can look at some of the huge demonstrations we've had in our city. The Women's March comes to mind. The March for Our Lives comes to mind. These large, extremely large, peaceful protests is something that we feel very comfortable managing. And if you look at the way that this particular event has moved forward, we've had a couple of days of really good, successful, peaceful demonstrations, and moving forward, that's what I expect, regardless of size, moving into the future. Was that too long of a answer?
Perfect.
Okay.
Are you in communication with the federal authorities? Because this gives the Attorney General Barr, sitting at the FBI, another opportunity to deploy federal lawmen, officers into our streets. This is a perfect opportunity for him.
There's a very close coordination between MPD and the federal government.
Chief, what does your crystal ball tell you? I can't recall how long Occupy DC lasted. Maybe you do, but what does your crystal ball tell you about how long this will last? How long we're doing? This will be day 7 today. You say we'll go through Saturday.
I'll say this. There's a lot of understandable passion around this movement, rightfully so. I think passion drives how long this might last. It'll really be a wait and see. I think it would just be. I don't think I can predict the future. The only thing that I would ask is that we continue to have people who come here act peacefully. I think that's a better avenue if we want to make change, to have that be accomplished.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
When I'm actually reporting a story, because I did this piece for Politico.
Oh, no. Wow.
The secret codes.
There's a process right now that we're following.
Just, what was helping us just respond back. Just say, I got your email.